Hi, and welcome to this Ignite Webcast. We have a lot of people on the call. Seems like a pretty diverse crowd today from all over the world. My name is Josh Topal, and I'm a program manager for Office 365. So Ignite events are a series of technical workshops for IT professionals and Microsoft partners. And the Ignite Webcast series will address different technical subjects and scenarios that are beneficial to anyone who wants to increase their knowledge of the Office 365 suite. So today we're happy to have Daniel Kenyon-Smith one more time as our presenter. And in this webcast, Daniel will be helping us understand DirSync. So if you haven't met Daniel yet, he is an Office 365 architect joining us from the UK. And today's session provides a great opportunity to hear directly from a Microsoft employee and learn about some of the new features and releases for Office 365. So if you haven't joined us for a webcast yet, it will be 1 hour. And we'll leave about 10 to 15 minutes at the end to field questions from anyone on the call. So I ask that you please hold your questions until the end, which will have our Q&A portion, and then we'll go ahead and we can type the questions into the link chat box, and Daniel will answer those. So one last thing is that we are recording today's session, and you'll be able to find the video and the PowerPoint presentation that Daniel's going to show on the blog post, which I'm going to go ahead and paste right in the window. So that's it, and should be a great session. So Daniel, whenever you're ready, go ahead.
Excellent, thanks Josh. Okay, so thanks everybody for joining. As Josh says, we're going to look at DirSync in this particular webcast. So let's get started. So in the agenda we've got an overview of directory sync, some of the requirements for directory sync, deployment options, understanding what directory sync does, and we've also, towards the back end of this module, got some deployment considerations as well around deploying directory sync. So essentially the bulk of this particular presentation will be around what we call the sort of standard DirSync appliance, but we will cover some of the other sort of variants of that, such as things like multi-forest, for example. So what is directory sync? So directory sync is basically a synchronization from your on-premise identity into Office 365. So your on-premise identity might be something like Active Directory, for example. It'll synchronize things like users, groups, and contacts from your on-premise identity up into Office 365 or in the Office 365 infrastructure, which will essentially be the Windows Azure Active Directory. So, as we said, there's a standard DirSync appliance. This appliance is software-based, so it's not a physical appliance, but essentially it's what we call as a set-it-and-forget-it type appliance. So initially, when DirSync was first released, it was literally a sort of a download from the Office 365 portal, and you would install the binaries on a particular server, and it would just essentially collect the information such as users, groups, and contacts, and specific attributes, which we'll have a look at as we push through this session. But it would collect all that information and synchronize that to Office 365. We have changed some of the support stance around this sort of software appliance, in that we can do some form of scoping or filtering, as it's called. So if you have a specific requirement around that, i.e. you don't want to synchronize everything for your on-premise directory up into Office 365, we do now support filtering and scoping, and again we'll cover that as we sort of progress through. But essentially the software appliance is, other than the scoping piece, is a sort of a next type install, and we'll leave that to do what it needs to do. And again we'll drill into more detail. The multi-forest piece is where we start to get a bit more complex. So we essentially, instead of having this sort of software appliance, which still uses FIM, Forefront Identity Manager, under the covers, but it's more of a trimmed down version is the software appliance. When we talk about multi-forest, always syncing from non-active directory sources, then we need the full forefront identity manager server, and that gives us much more sort of flexibility of synchronizing from different forests on premise into Office 365. So again, we'll talk a little bit more about those as we push through. So the purpose of directory sync is to, in simple terms really, is to have a unified unified global address list, certainly from an Exchange perspective. So again, all of the objects that we have on premise is where we master those objects, i.e. any new users that we create them on premise. Any objects that we want to change or update, with regards to their attributes, again, if it's Exchange, things like proxy addresses or Active Directory attributes, we master and change all of those on premise as you do today, and then we let directory sync filter, sync that information up to Office 365. So that's quite key. It allows us to, directory sync allows us to establish things like single sign-on functionality, and we did have a session a few weeks ago around sort of single sign-on using things like ADFS, Active Directory Federation Services. So if you look at the links that Josh has posted into the window, we do have some previous sessions around single sign-on and identity. So obviously go and have a look at those sessions. As we said, it provides this unified global address list. And it's also required if we want to do something like Exchange hybrid, where we want to have some mailboxes on premise and some in the cloud, and we want that full feature-rich integration between on-premise and Office 365. And again, we've got a session that we ran last week around hybrid. So if you're interested in what hybrid does and the features around hybrid, then again go look at the past sessions that Josh has just posted the link in there as well. So and it also provides coexistence for things like link as well. So again, when we synchronize from our on-premise directory, and we'll see a slide on this later on, it synchronizes into the Windows Azure Active Directory, and then essentially provisions that account into the various workloads within inside Office 365. So Exchange, Link, and SharePoint, for example. So, as I said, the sort of purpose of directory sync is to synchronize any changes, modifications, or additions that you add to your on-premise environment. So, as we say, we master all of the objects on-premise through your existing infrastructure, and then directory sync. If we're talking about the directory sync appliance, then that will sync up every 3 hours by default up into Office 365. We can force a sync more regular than 3 hours, but 3 hours is what's sort of hard coded into the tool. But we can force a sync by using some commands, which again we'll cover that just towards the back end of this session. So directory sync is not intended just to have a single bulk upload into Office 365. It's meant to be sort of an ongoing synchronization from your on-premises environment into Office 365. So some of the different options that we do have for directory synchronization. We've got the directory sync appliance, which is essentially the blue one on the left, which is suitable for organizations where you've got single Active Directory forests, for example. You just want to support coexistence between on-premise and cloud, whether that's a simple coexistence scenario, or whether that's more a feature-rich scenario, such as hybrid, for example. Directory sync appliance is perfect for that sort of solution. We've also got in the middle the Office 365 connector. So this is more of a complex configuration of directory sync, and is currently only available through MCS Microsoft Consultancy Services engagements or through certain partners in order to be able to deploy this version of Directory Sync. And in the Office 365 version allows us to be able to sync from multiple forests, for example, or from non-Active Directory identities. So maybe if you've got something like Shibboleth or something on premise, but what it does require is it does require that forefront identity manager, the FIM server, and therefore you need the FIM server license that is also coupled with that. You may also require something like a Visual Studio license, and essentially the Visual Studio license can be used for coding things like the FIM rules and extensions and helping with some of the troubleshooting. So as I said, the Directory Sync Appliance on the left is where we can download that from the Office 365 portal. The Office 365 connector is only available through MCS and certain partners, and then we've got this PowerShell and Graph API. So basically Windows Azure Graph will provide programmatic access into Windows Azure, and it does this through the REST API endpoints. So basically what it means is developers can do things like create, execute, update, read and delete objects that are located in Windows Azure and manipulate those objects and run operations against them. I mean, the PowerShell and Graph APIs are almost, if you compare that to the on-premise world, is using something like ADSI Edit, for example. When you're using the cloud, you use things like the PowerShell and the Graph APIs to do that. There's a couple of points to know around the PowerShell and Graph. They're not designed for directory synchronization, and the operations can take longer to perform due to server-side throttling that's configured, and there's certain features that are not supported using PowerShell or Graph provisioning. So if you're provisioning for a large number of users, then we recommend to use things like Directory Sync or FIM because of those performance reasons and some of the things I've just mentioned there as well. So the various versions of the Directory Sync appliance. So initially we had the 64-bit, the 32-bit, which is no longer supported. So if you go into the portal now and download the binaries from the Office 365 portal, then essentially you'll be downloading the 64-bit. So if you already have been using Office 365 for a little while and you've already downloaded the previous version of Directory Sync, the Directory Sync appliance, then you'll need to upgrade from your current 32-bit up to the new now supported 64-bit version. So in order to access the download, you can just log into the Office 365 portal, i.e. into your tenant. You can click on the users and groups, and then you can select Setup Active Directory Synchronization, and you can go in and download the binaries from there. And as we said, if you want to, or you should be upgrading from the 32-bit to the 64-bit, so essentially just go into your add remove programs on the server, obviously where you've installed Directory Sync, and you just need to remove the Directory Sync binaries from that server. Of course, if there's a synchronization in process, then it'll give you a warning to say that you can't remove the binaries, and then obviously just retry at a later point when the Directory Sync is finished, and then install the 64-bit version. There is an article on the maybe it's on TechNet, or it might be on the Office 365 community, that does tell you about upgrading from the 32-bit to the 64-bit. So we mentioned about scoping earlier, so we can now scope and filter our objects from Office 365, on-premise to Office 365, and essentially what that means is you can, essentially filter out specific objects or OUs, for example, from synchronizing up into Office 365. The only thing to be aware of around scoping and filtering is that obviously if you're synchronizing the entire Active Directory forest, for example, and then you decide to start doing some filtering and scoping, then any of the objects that are now no longer part of the scope, i.e. you've reduced it from the forest down to specific OUs, those other objects will be deleted in Office 365. So obviously if they've got a mailbox associated with that, then that mailbox will essentially go into that recycle bin for 30 days, but essentially you've started to delete that particular object. And that can be the case of someone that doesn't fully understand that you've scoped your on-premise environment and removes accidentally an OU. The same thing would happen obviously as soon as it's no longer part of the scope, then it starts to remove the objects in Office 365. So you have to be very careful around the scoping piece. And for the standard directory sync, it uses the AD GUID as the source anchor. So the source anchor is the link between your on-premise object and Office 365. So that's why when you perform an upgrade from 32 to 64-bit, you can remove the binaries from the server, reinstall, and it will, assuming the GUID's not changed, then it'll just reconnect those objects back together again, and that's how it does that, by using that source anchor. From a multi-forest perspective, so again we're using the FIM deployment here, so we're talking specifically around Forefront Identity Manager, the actual server itself that gets installed. Again, we can do things like scoping of objects, we've got much more flexibility, and from a FIM deployment, you have to select the source anchor yourself. Now, we're talking about on this slide, it could be the employee ID, it could be something like the GUID, but obviously what you would need to consider is if you're moving objects between the two Active Directory forests and you have the GUID selected as the source anchor, then of course that GUID will change between one forest and the other. Therefore, when you move that object, the next sync occurs, it thinks it's got a new object as far as Office 365 is concerned. So you just have to select that source anchor accordingly, and that could be something like employee ID, which may never change. So I just slotted a slide in here really of a sort of a typical customer that I've been working with fairly recently around their sort of multi-forest deployment. And actually, when we look at this slide, FIM, or the Forefront Identity Manager server, is right down at the bottom of the sort of UK site. And essentially we've got some management agents that are hooking into each of the other forests in the other locations, and then we've got the multi-forest Office 365 connector that then connects into Office 365 and syncs the objects. So the management agents will collect all the information from each of the forests, collect that into its local database, and then synchronize that to Office 365. We've got some other bits on here as well. We won't go into too much detail around these, but these are obviously around the ADFS and Active Directory Federation services, the sort of single sign-on and single identity pieces. And again, we've covered that in a previous session. So yes, so as far as the FIM piece goes, certainly on this diagram looks fairly straightforward, but again you need to make sure you select the source anchors and make sure that you configure the rules accordingly based on that specific requirement from that particular customer. So as we say, the multi-forest scenario, so it will support multiple Active Directory forests. So we're talking here specifically around resource forest scenarios. We're not talking about multiple Exchange organizations. So we're just talking about the resource forest where you would have Exchange in one forest and user accounts in another. As we've said, from a licensing perspective, you would have to have a FIM server license, and as we said, possibly the Visual Studio license for doing things like the coding of the FIM rules. As of where the standard DirSync appliance that we said you can download from the Office 365 portal is a free download. So it just depends on, again, on the scenario as to whether you have a requirement for multiple forests or not. Again, using the FIM solution, we can synchronize from non-Active Directory sources as well. So, you know, there's some sort of academies or colleges, universities and things that don't always have Active Directory on premise, and they tend to be a good fit for also using FIM, because again, it's not Active Directory is their source identity. So some of the requirements then for directory sync. And I've put in a sort of a prerequisite remediation. So the reason why I've done this is depending on the structure of your objects or the configuration of some of those objects and how clean the on-premise Active Directory environment is will obviously depend on what will sync to Office 365. So what we mean by that is depending on whether you've got things like UPNs configured, if you've got invalid characters that have been put into Active Directory, for example. And what we've got is this deployment readiness tool, the DRT tool, and again it's down. You can download that from the community site. I've put the URL up on there if you've not seen that before. And essentially you can run this DRT tool to analyze your on-premise environment, and it will give you a report at the end of it, which essentially says, you know, what needs remediating with regards to the sort of following bullets on here. So one of them is around domains, so it'll do an email domain discovery and look at the number of users that are using each of those domains. We've got things like the identity and account provisioning, so we'll get things like statistical information, the Active Directory schema and domain function levels, any trusts, so it'll check if you've got multi-forest trusts in place. It'll do things like the directory synchronization, it'll do some pre-checks and some attribute assessments. So again, it'll list any of the objects that need remediating and tidying up, because some objects may not synchronize up to Office 365 if they're not formatted correctly, and therefore obviously you wouldn't get the unified GAL. Directory Sync would report that, of course, that some objects are not synchronizing, but if you do this work up front, then hopefully by the time you start Directory Sync, then you'll get a clean synchronization straight into Office 365. So the online, so the single sign-on piece as well, it'll do things like attribute assessment around that. It'll do some work, an investigation around Exchange Online, so it'll look at things like statistical information, any public delegates, any proxy addresses, sort of any third-party and unified proxy address information that's been populated. It'll do the same sort of thing from a link perspective, so it'll look at things like SIP domains, any statistical information, and again, it'll do the same sort of thing from a SharePoint perspective. And then from the client, it will just look at the domain joined machines, and it'll look at the rich experience and readiness for things like single sign-on. And then from a network perspective, it'll look at things like ports, endpoints, and DNS records as well. So it's well worth running that tool beforehand. Look at the output and then remediate all of the recommended remediation tasks before kicking off the directory sync to Office 365. So directory sync, the standard appliance, we're talking about single forest here. It must be domain joined within the same forest that you're synchronizing from. And it can't be installed on the same server as a domain controller. We do support the directory sync to be virtualized, and it needs to be installed on Windows 2008 64-bit. And when you run the DRT, which we just talked about in the last slide, it will list the number of objects that you've got in your Active Directory source domain. And based on the number of objects, we have some sort of basic guidance that says if you've got 50,000 objects, then based on a particular size of those objects, then the database is probably going to be around about 10 gig. I mean, that it's probably not going to be 10 gig, but essentially that's the guidance that we follow. So if you have more than 50,000 objects in your on-premise AD, then you would need to install full SQL, because there's for SQL Express, which gets installed by default with DirSync, there's a 10 gig has got a 10 gig limit on SQL Express. So if you've got larger than 50,000 objects, then you would need to install full SQL. And there's some information on the internet about how you can point it to an existing SQL server, or you can install full SQL on the same box as directory sync. So there's some information on there on how you configure directory sync to use full SQL, not the SQL Express. And then, as we already said, there's the 64-bit multi-forest appliance, and that's the Office 365 connector. And as we said, that's for more complex scenarios where we may have multiple forests, and we want to synchronize both of those forests up into Office 365. And then I've just started to add a few notes from the field on a few of these slides as well, just as a few pointers, really. When you're using full SQL, you need to make sure that the EA account has sysadmin rights on the SQL database, and the directory sync service has public permissions on the directory sync database as well. Otherwise, you may have issues creating and installing directory sync to use that particular database. So we mentioned about scoping and filtering. So you can scope objects, and you do that by managing the source AD management agent in directory sync, and that enables you to select which organizational units you want to synchronize to Office 365, and which domains and objects that you don't want to sync. So, for example, you could add a string into one of the extension attributes that's saying don't sync, and then essentially those objects wouldn't sync to the cloud if they match that particular attribute. So we can scope at the following levels, things like AD, OU, and attribute level, and there may be some additional capabilities that will come with the Office 365 connector, as we say, because we've got the full version of FIM as of where the directory sync appliances is just a trimmed down version of that. Again, just some notes from the field then. When installing directory sync, you use the enterprise admin credentials, and all the DCs are accessible. So I think we've got a slide which maybe it's not the next one, maybe the one after, which talks about some of the ports that are required internally for directory sync to be able to talk to the domain controllers. So when you install directory sync, it will try and talk to every domain controller in the forest, essentially. So when we talk about hardware recommendations, so again, depending on the number of objects, it depends on the CPU. Well, essentially the CPU is the same. It's more around the memory and the hard disk space for those particular servers. So the thing to be conscious of is if you initially start off with, let's say, a pilot, for example, and you maybe do some form of filtering or scoping, and then you roll it out to the entire business, or for one reason or another, you populate your Active Directory with more objects than you originally started with, you just need to be conscious that whatever you spec your original directory sync server at, that it will cope with a load of what your sort of end number of objects will be. So if you started with 10,000 or less, and then you sort of ramped that up to 120,000, then you just need to be conscious that the memory and hard disks would need to be increased in order to cope with that additional load. Yeah, so this is the network requirements slide. So essentially, when we're synchronizing with directory sync, it will synchronize outbound over port 443. But when we install directory sync internally, it will, as we said, try and talk to all the domain controllers in the forest, and it will try and use these ports that we've got on the right-hand side. So we need to make sure that we can connect over these ports internally to all of the DCs in your forest. So the permissions that are required, so you need enterprise admin rights, and you need to have local admin rights in order to be able to install directory sync. Now, when we use the enterprise admin rights, essentially what it does, and we'll look at this in another slide, but you use the enterprise admin rights, and that enterprise admin account is specifically used just for a portion of the install, which allows you to then be able to create the relevant users inside your Active Directory forest to then allow you to sync up to Office 365 using that new account that that's just been created as part of the install. So it's only specifically there to provision a sync account essentially, and then the enterprise admin credentials are sort of discarded and never used again. So it's not that it always uses enterprise admin credentials. So the account also needs to have access to the MIIS admins group and will automatically be added. And you also need permissions in the Office 365 tenant as well, of course. You'll need to have global admin rights in Office 365. So obviously you can write and update any of the object changes that are synchronizing from on-prem to Office 365. One thing that I have noticed actually before is where a customer has created a global admin account in Office 365 and passwords expired, and therefore directory sync has tried to obviously connect to Office 365 using that global admin account. Passwords expired, and therefore obviously no changes have replicated. So you just need to be conscious that if you are using an account that you can you keep an eye on it essentially, and make sure that things like the passwords don't expire. So this is what we just touched on in the last slide. So the enterprise admin permissions is essentially what's used to create an MSOL_AD_sync account, and that's created in the user's container of the root domain. So leave that where it is. Don't be moving that account around. And essentially those accounts, or that account, is used just for synchronizing objects up to Office 365 going forward. So obviously any changes that you make on premise, I use that account then to synchronize. So if you have hybrid in place, then essentially we have an option to enable rich coexistence, and the rich coexistence essentially means that we can write back specific attributes from Office 365 back into your on-premise environment. And again, it'll create an MSOL_AD_sync rich coexistence group, and that's in the user's container again in the root domain. So what that basically means is that if, for example, you had, let's say, an archive in the cloud, and the mailbox was on-premise, then we would write back that attribute to the on-premise Active Directory to say that your mailbox is on-premise, but actually your archive is located in Office 365. It writes back those attributes and then obviously allows Outlook to be able to connect to the online archive if that's located in Office 365. Okay. So the synchronization, as we've said, what will it synchronize? So it synchronizes things like user objects, group objects. It'll synchronize things like your mail-enabled objects. And I've got a slide. It might be this one actually that just gives you a high level of a select few attributes that are synchronized, but there's a whole list, so we'll come to that in a minute. Passwords are not synchronized. They're not synchronized at the moment, and they're not synchronized by the default DirSync appliance, but we do hope to have some password synchronization coming out soon, and there is an early onboarding program underway for this. And basically what password synchronization is different to federation. In the federation, you require things like on-premise ADFS servers, the Active Directory Federation servers, so you need to be able to maintain those. As of where password sync is integrated into or will be integrated into the directory sync tool, and then and that type of appliance will align better to some customers' strategy, which is all about cloud and reducing the number of on-premise servers and reducing costs that are associated with maintaining on-premise Active Directory Federation servers. One thing to note about the password synchronization is that the password sync will apply at the tenant level only, so it won't be configurable on a per user basis. It'll be essentially a password hash that will be synchronized. So the hash itself will be transmitted over an encrypted channel, so SSL. And there's also no requirement using password sync to enable things like reversible password encryption in Active Directory. So reversible password encryption is basically when you're storing your passwords in clear text. So there's no requirement to do any of that. So this is a real sort of high level, well, essentially only 4 attributes that are synchronized up to the Windows Azure Active Directory. But you can see on the support article that I've listed in there that if you go to that article, then it will list all of the attributes that are synchronized to Office 365, and also the subset of attributes which we've seen on this slide already that are written back if you enable Exchange Hybrid. Those objects, as we said, those attributes will be written back to your on-premise AD. So go have a look at that support link, and if you want to have a look at the full list of attributes that synchronize to Office 365. Right, so from a synchronization perspective, we've said that we can do some write-backs, so that's if we enable the hybrid piece. It will synchronize every 3 hours by default, but you can log on to the Directory Sync server. You can open up PowerShell, but you need to navigate to the program files and then the Microsoft Online Directory Sync folder, and you can run a Directory Sync config shell. And then once you've opened that up, you can then run a command called start online coexistence sync, and that would then force synchronization outside of that regular 3-hour window. So if there's a particular object or something that you've created straight away, and you want that to synchronize, almost immediately, then you just run the start online coexistence sync, and then that would sync essentially straight to Office 365. We'll look at a slide as to exactly how that works in the background. It would need to take some information from Active Directory, load that into the local database, and then synchronize that to Office 365. So there will still be a small delay, and that depends obviously on the number of changes that you've made inside Active Directory as well. You can also check in the portal as well. So again, under the users and groups, you can see the last time directory sync occurred. You can also have a look in the event logs, in the application log on the directory sync server, and you can see some event IDs in there to see that directory sync has successfully completed, or whether it started, or the progress of directory sync. Okay, so following on from that, as we mentioned before, contacts and objects. So anything that you delete on premise, then of course filters through and deletes in Office 365 as well. So if you delete an on-premise object, then that removes the object from Active Directory, and therefore synchronizes that change up into Office 365, and therefore deletes that as well. Same goes for disabling. So you disable an on-premise account, then obviously that gets disabled in Office 365 as well, so stops users from accessing the service once it's been disabled. Now, one thing to note is that when we install Directory Sync, we synchronize the objects up to Office 365, we may provision them a new Exchange mailbox, for example, and maybe a new link, or we may do a migration from on-premise to Office 365. But essentially, we have to enable the license, so that's not something that Directory Sync does for us. We would need to either do that through the GUI in the portal, or we could do that through a PowerShell command to enable the licenses. So when we disable an account, the licenses are not automatically unassigned. So if you have a pool of, let's say 5,000 licenses, if you disable an account, and that account had a license assigned, you would need to go in and unassign that license to free that license back up so another user can use that. But we do have a recoverable time of 30 days. So if somebody, let's say you have been doing that filtering and scoping, and somebody has unticked an OU, and therefore the deletion has started in Office 365, then you can recover that item within 30 days. But of course, if the 30 days have passed, then the item will no longer be recoverable. So when we first install directory sync, it will do a full directory sync, of course, assuming you've not done any synchronization before. So the first time you do a sync, could take a while. That depends on obviously the number of objects that you've got within inside your on-premises identity, and you would be able to determine the number of objects that you've got based on running that deployment readiness tool that we talked about, the DRT tool. So we're essentially saying that depending on the number of objects, then we're looking approximately like sort of 5,000 objects every 45 to 60 minutes. So obviously, if you're talking hundreds of thousands of objects, then you're talking potentially a lot of hours, or even into days when you first do your directory sync. So it's well worth planning ahead. Maybe even kicking it off on a Friday and leaving that synchronizing over the weekend, for example. So obviously, once you've done the full synchronization, then we only synchronize delta changes going forward. So of course, if you're making changes to a lot of attributes on a regular basis, then again we're back into that approximate 5,000 objects to 45 to 60 minutes. But if you're not changing objects on a regular basis, then of course that will synchronize a lot quicker. And that depends on the organization, of course. So there could be movers, joiners, leavers, or it could even be particular applications that are going in and making changes to attributes that sync to Office 365 and therefore impacting the synchronization time to Office 365. So just a sort of a real high-level slide of exactly the high-level process, I guess. So we install directory sync. As we've said, we type in the relevant credentials. We've got directory sync now running on the local server. So what it will do is the first sort of cycle, it will start to collect all the information, so the users group contacts from your source forest, and it will essentially start to load that into the directory sync server onto the directory sync database. And then what it will do is Microsoft Online Services will kind of reach out and connect to directory sync and pull the information from the directory sync server and synchronize all of those objects up into Office 365 and take that out of the metaverse on directory sync. And then, of course, any subsequent changes, you would get a delta changes up to Office 365 from directory sync. So that's just a sort of high level. But as we've said, all directory sync will require is port 443, and that will be outbound only, and it'll be directory sync that essentially initiates that particular session. Okay, so I think my link has just started to play up a little bit. I don't know, Josh, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here.
I don't know whether you could just sort of take over and just move on to the next slide for me. The link seems to have just stopped.
Okay. So I'm running through the steps. Sync cycle step 1. You want to just go to the next slide?
Yeah, go to the next slide, please. Yeah, so if we just go to slide 30, actually.
Sorry. Went backwards, sorry.
Yeah, so that's just the coexistence piece, yeah. So on slide 30, yeah. So What is coexistence? So, as we've said, some users are provisioned on-premise, some will be provisioned in Office 365, and essentially it's given us that unified global address list. We manage all of our on-premise objects, and then we synchronize that to Office 365. Yeah, do you want me to take over, Josh, or do you want to just flip? Shall I just let you know when we flip through the slides? Or should we?
Sure, that's fine.
Yeah, so we just move to the next slide then, please. So we also talked in some previous sessions around simple coexistence. So we talked about some simple migrations, such as things like IMAP. There was a cutover migration and there's a staged migration. So with a staged migration, it's essentially using directory sync, and that's all we have. It essentially gives us this routing domain, so we can have a shared SMTP namespace between on-premise and Office 365, but we don't get the rich features like we do with hybrid, where we've got calendar sharing, free busy, cross-premise mail tips, and all those types of things. But with a simple coexistence, we could use cloud IDs, or we could be using things like ADFS, i.e. federated IDs as well. But with a simple coexistence, we've said that you don't require any on-premises hybrid server, i.e. an Exchange server, but of course if we want to use a simple coexistence, we would need the directory sync server. Okay, Josh? Yes. And that's the same for a hybrid deployment. So as we just mentioned there, directory sync is a requirement for hybrid. So we won't be able to set up and configure hybrid without having directory sync in place. As we've said, as we go through the install of directory sync, we can select that we also want to do the write back, so the rich coexistence, and essentially just give us a unified gal. So again, even with the hybrid piece, we could have cloud identities, or we could have federated identities. So federated identities are not a requirement, but is a recommendation for best user experience. So obviously you can use the on-premise identities, passwords, restrictions, and all those types of things. Okay, Josh. Yeah. So some of the deployment considerations. So as we said, you need to run the DIRT tool first. That will give you a list of what needs to be remediated. So we recommend that you do any Active Directory cleanup work before you install directory sync. Tidy that up, clear that, make sure you've got a clean source environment. Obviously what you sync from on-premise will sync to Office 365. So also with Office 365, if you were to create a new tenant, there is currently a 50,000 object limit by default in your tenant. So again, if you run the deployment readiness tool and you have more than 50,000 objects, i.e. you might have something like 80,000 or 100,000 for example, if you didn't log a support call through support to get that tenant extended to the number of objects that you've got, directory sync would essentially sync up to 50,000, and then you'd see a log in the event view that essentially says that you can no longer sync because you've reached the limit of your tenant. So you need to make sure that you log a call, and support will ask for that deployment readiness tool as well. Will require the output of that before they can extend that tenant. Okay, Josh. So the UPN piece, so this sort of comes back to the accessing the workloads within Office 365. So any of the workloads that we access, Exchange for example, we require things like the UPN. So you need to make sure that the UPN is configured within inside the objects in Active Directory. What you configure that to is, I guess, down to the business. It may match your SMTP address, for example, or it may not. But for ease of use, we recommend that does match your SMTP address. And we also need to make sure that that UPN suffix is publicly routable, so we don't support things like .local, for example. You can create a new UPN suffix, so you could go into, I think it's domains and trusts in Active Directory and create a new UPN if required. But essentially, you would need to configure the UPN for each of your objects or your user objects on premise, and then obviously that would sync up to Office 365, and then that's what users would use to access the services and the different workloads. We also, of course, recommend verifying, add, register, and verify all of your SMTP domains, so we can make sure that all of the proxy addresses that you have on premise also get synchronized as part of directory sync up to Office 365. So I think that's pretty much it, actually, Josh. We can probably go to the next slide, and then I guess we can look at some of the questions.
Great. Thanks a lot. Fantastic presentation, Daniel.